Does the president plan to condemn the leak of the Supreme Court draft opinion or the doxing of the justices now that we've seen violence unfold?
We have not seen violence or vandalism against Supreme Court justices. We have seen it at Catholic churches. That's unacceptable. The president does not support that. We have seen it at some conservative organizations. That we don't support that. We understand the passion, we understand the concern, but what the president's position is that that should be peaceful, the protest.
Somebody ought to show the president the actual law. That's the White House on the protests happening at the homes of U.S. Supreme Court justices. So are the White House and its Justice Department serious about keeping the peace? Well, if they are, it must be a big secret, because federal law makes it illegal to picket or parade outside a judge's personal home, especially in an attempt to influence the outcome of a case. I'm going to read this to you. I'll be quick. 18 U.S. Code 1503. Whoever corruptly or by threats of force or by any threatening letter or communication, it is against the law. Those endeavors to influence, intimidate, or impede any juror or officer of any court of the United States. That is 18 U.S. Code 1503. I hope the president reads it. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell says it's time the demonstrators are held accountable.
The left is set out to harass and intimidate sitting judges as they consider a pending case. It is an attempt to replace the rule of law with the rule of mobs. Attorney General Garland's Justice Department was quick to treat the concerned parents of America like potential domestic terrorists. But curiously, I haven't heard any announcement about how the DOJ may handle these intimidation tactics aimed directly at federal judges.
Even the Washington Post editorial board is calling on these people to, quote unquote, leave the justices alone at home. Meanwhile, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is praising the protesters for what she calls their righteous anger. Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee sits on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the senator is in focus right now. Good to see you. First of all, your reaction to the fact that the DOJ is completely silent on this, when I just read, look, they have law, they could take action.
They could take action, and they ought to be taking action. They ought to be marching every one of these people down to the police, their headquarters, and then booking them for being in violation. You just read the code and exactly what it says. This is against the law. What they are doing is against the law. But I have to tell you, Harris, as we look at this, it is becoming apparent that this was a leaker from the left, a Democrat, who wanted to undermine the work of a justice and who wanted to reach a different outcome. And in order to do that, what they are doing is something unprecedented. They released a working paper that justices used to pass between one another to arrive at a decision that they wanted. And now, in order to push it even further, you have these leftist activists who are organizing these protests in front of justices' homes. This is unsafe. It disrupts the entire community. They are trying to do it as a source of embarrassment to the justices, but what they're doing is embarrassing themselves, and their actions, they have to be held to account.
Well, and we hope, and hope is not a strategy, but you know, we have the expectation that they will control themselves in this instance. Anything can happen accidentally, incidentally. Anything can happen when you're on somebody else's property. Like you don't want to be that close. You just don't. It's against the law, and it can be a slippery slope. And as you said, we've gone from a really seditious leak to bad behavior now breaking the law. There is a connection there. It's like, well, if you're not going to hold that side accountable for what it did with the leak, then we can do whatever we want. I want to get to this. The leader of the Wisconsin pro-life group, Senator, that's the offices of which were allegedly attacked over the weekend. Well, that leader has told Fox Digital this: we need stronger leadership that makes it very clear that we don't just disagree with it, we are calling it to stop right now. These are thugs. They are attempting to bully us, to intimidate us. We will not be silent. So this isn't a person's home, but it is the very violence that the White House said is not happening.
And we know that there is violence. There was violence at some of the cathedrals, at the violence that was carried out at this office of a pro-life group. This has no place. But what you see happening is the left's response. Look at Schumer's response. He wants to put on the floor a piece of legislation that goes much further than Dobbs. It would go further than France or Poland. It would go further. It would be an abortion on demand 24/7 for whatever reason. It would allow dismemberment abortions. And Harris, this is something that it's inconceivable that they are pushing this, making this such an issue. As I've talked to women all across Tennessee, what they've said, oh, you know, at first we thought there was going to be a ban on abortion. We realized that is not true. That this is saying the states have the right to set the regulation and restrictions on abortion. Most women think that's a good thing. They like that. They appreciate that. It gives the state legislatures the ability to make that choice as to how they want to set the rules and regulations on abortion. So the misleading that is involved with this, the not focusing on the leak, but immediately jumping to politicize this, the remarks of Pelosi, the remarks of Schumer, the way they have not called out people that are protesting, breaking the law at the homes of these judges, it is something that does need to be addressed, and the president, the White House, should take the responsibility of addressing this.
Look, and somewhere along the line, since the president says he's going to get out on the campaign trail for the midterm election, somewhere on the lines, they're going to have to explain, Democrats, why when they had a bicameral leadership on the Hill and the White House under Barack Obama, they didn't codify Roe versus Wade. If that's what they really felt so strongly about, maybe they didn't have the support that they thought they had, and now they don't have to explain anything. They can just fight, blame it all on Republicans.
Yes, and that's what they're trying to do. That is exactly what they're trying to do. Nothing is their fault. Everything is the fault of Republicans. They're not wanting to talk about the leak. They don't want to talk about the open border. They don't want to talk about human trafficking. They don't want to talk about inflation, the price at the pump, the gas prices. They don't want to talk about Russia and Ukraine. They don't want to talk about the Chinese Communist Party.
No.
But they feel like they've got a nugget of an issue. They are very wrong. They are misjudging this. People are tremendously upset about the leak and what that has led to in the actions of these protesters.
Senator Marsha Blackburn from the great state of Tennessee, thank you for being in
Thank
focus.
you.